Now that free agent season has begun, I better make my predictions. Those predictions that never come true.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans, and welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter or whatever it's called these days, and on Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball Podcast and Instagram. The best way to get a hold of me is right here on the YouTubes, and make sure to leave that hashtag Everyday Sully. It helps us find your messages. And hey, by the way, thanks so much for making the Locked On Podcast Network the #1 sports podcasting network. Look at that. I'm loving this. We've been around for a little bit, and we're getting our audience, and I'm loving it. And I can tell you that today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. If your bet wins, then you'll get 300 tomatoes and bonus bets to use across the app. Download the app today. And by tomatoes, I, of course, mean dollars. They will not pay off in tomatoes. And let's go over the trivia question, which was, who was the first Atlanta Brave to win the MVP? And there's a part of it, which is, I think this is an amazing, I did a double take when I saw this. Who was the first Atlanta Brave to win the MVP? Now, Muskie Wrestler said, I'm going to take a huge guess and say Eddie Matthews. You would think it was Eddie Matthews. You would also think that maybe it would have been his teammate, a fellow by the name of Henry Aaron. But Henry Aaron won the MVP one time. One time he won it. And that was as a member of the Milwaukee Braves. Eddie Matthews did not win as a member of the Atlanta Braves. Now, Angelo Durat took a big swing on Deion Sanders. No, he did not ever win the MVP. And I don't think he ever won the MVP in the NFL. But do you know what? I admire that. Shows you're taking a real big guess there, and you didn't look it up. Now, Mike O'Hare -Z90. Dale Murphy. Yes, Dale Murphy, friend of the podcast. Dale Murphy appeared on this podcast back on 2019. Could not be a nicer guy. Is on the Hall of Fame ballot, and I want him to get into the Hall of Fame. Do I think he's a slam dunk for the Hall of Fame? No. Do I understand the arguments against it? Yes. Do I want to be able to say I've had a Hall of Famer as a guest on this show? You betcha. And you are never going to find a nicer guy who basically carried the Braves in some of their really darkest times. So, good luck on that. By the way, a nice Strat wrote to me that I sound like John Candy. Look, I'm a huge John Candy fan. I love John Candy, and I love that you said I don't have the girth of John Candy. I could afford to lose some weight. Thanks. I've heard Jay Leno before. I hear Jeff Garlin all the time from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Okay. I don't hear it, but there you go. By the way, one of my students, as you know, I'm a special ed teacher. One of my students said that I remind him of the guy who plays the Hulk. And I'm assuming they mean Mark Ruffalo and not Lou Ferrigno. But I'll tell you something, I'll take either one. That kid got an A. Excuse me, I gotta scratch my nose for a second. It's pouring here in Pasadena. Naylor got signed. I did the whole episode yesterday of him signing with the Seattle Mariners, and I think that was a fantastic signing for the Mariners. I don't think any Mariner fan was unhappy with that. And as I said, it is a sign that Seattle management says, okay, we got to deal with one of our problems. Let's take one of them right off the plate. They got to make sure that they have their infield built up and doing well. Naylor on that lineup, along with Rosarena, along with Raleigh, along with Julio Rodriguez. I think they're going to have a terrific lineup. I think they got a solid pitching staff. I think they need to strengthen that infield, and Naylor was a great addition to to be able to retain him. But I realized, okay, if players are starting to sign, I got to start doing my free agent predictions. These don't tend to come true the way I want, but we will do this now. Earmark this episode is being dropped late on the 17th of November, 2025. You'll probably hear it on the 18th day. And I listed here, I have here on my little Google Doc that I have right over here, the top 25 as listed by ESPN, the top 25, actually ESPN, a couple other sources. I just put the names that seem to be hitting the most. The top 25 free agents for this offseason. And the top one is probably Kyle Tucker, the former Astros star, found himself with the Chicago Cubs. Cubs made it back to the postseason this year, and they took the Milwaukee Brewers to Game 5. They actually they advanced. They beat a very good San Diego team. They took the Brewers to the brink. And Kyle Tucker is hitting free agency. There's a lot of noise that he would be a good fit with the Yankees. I think my prediction is he's going to go to the San Francisco Giants. The Giants need offense. The Giants need relevance. The Giants could see there's an opening or two if a team like the Cubs regress to get a wild card spot. And the Giants have a new manager, and they have Buster Posey, who's running the team, who wants to win now. Kyle Tucker seems like he's a hitter who'd be able to play well in San Francisco. And believe me, I spend my summers up in the Bay Area, and San Francisco is absolutely drooling to have a contender. And they made the move for Devers. And I think Devers having his full season, look at as a native New Englander, a lifelong Red Sox fan, Devers can hit. And we'll get to the Red Sox later in this list here. They're both left-handed, so I don't know what that's going to do for everyone's thought process here. But I think that the Giants want to make a splash. And I don't just mean into McCovey Cove. They want to make sure that the San Francisco fans have something to cheer for. I'm sure they're a little tired of the Dodgers. Dodgers have won 3 World Series titles this decade. The Giants won 3 World Series titles the last decade. The Giants want to get back into it, and they want to make a big splash. Sorry, my nose is itchy. It's the weather. The number 2 big free agent, Bo Bichette. Now, there's a lot of places he could land, including New York, the New York Yankees. But I think he's going to stay with the Toronto Blue Jays. I think there's too much for the Blue Jays. I think they can't afford to lose the momentum and the huge house, and the fact that the fans in Toronto are going to be salivating that they got to within a Will Smith toe being lifted slightly or a collision in left field away from a World Series title. And losing Bo Bichette, even though they played the first few rounds of the postseason without him, I think that would be a big, big loss for them. So I think they're going to not part ways. Likewise, I think Kyle Schwarber is staying right in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Phillies have had a couple of really good windows of opportunity, but they blew some games against the Mets in 2024. They fell apart in their first 2 games in Philly and then threw to the wrong base in the clincher game against Los Angeles. Their window of opportunity is not as big as it used to be, but they can't afford to lose Kyle Schwarber. And they know that. And so I think he's going to stick around. I think Tucker's going to the Giants. I think Bichette and Schwarber are sticking around. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other big free agents out there. And some of them will be changing teams. And some of them are going to some clubs. They're going to have to start spending money to mollify their fan base. The NBA is back, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of a game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps getting all your games exciting, and especially when your team is making for that late push. So right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thanks so much for making Locked On MLB your first listen. And thanks so much for helping us become the number one sports podcasting network. Okay, let's get on with the other free agents here. Pete Alonso, he's re-signed with the Mets last year, and he's opted out. And I think he should stay with the Mets. I think he's a perfect fit with the Mets. He's a huge fan favorite with the Mets, but I don't think he's going to come back. I think the Mets are going to make some changes. And there's a contending team that I think fits perfectly, that he would come in, it'd be absolutely perfect puzzle piece, and that's the Boston Red Sox. The Red Sox, Roman Anthony, and a bunch of their young players are on that team. They're going to probably have to make a move to, free up a little space in their outfield and use that to probably give themselves some additional pitching depth. I think Duran is probably going to be moved. But putting that big slugger like Pete Alonso in the lineup, they need a big thumper. That was the one thing that kept them from beating the Yankees. If only the Red Sox had a slugger like, I don't know, Rafael Devers, a classic Yankee killer, in the middle of their lineup, they would have gotten that big hit in game 2 and probably would have advanced. Would the Blue Jays have punched him in the mouth? Yeah, probably. I think Alonso is that big thumper they need in the middle of their lineup. And I think for the short term, it would help out. And I think that will mean they'll lose Alex Bregman. I think Bregman's gone. So they're going to need to build upon that. And the whole idea of trading away Devers, the deal that, I'm sorry, wasn't, in the short term, didn't provide a lot. He was bad in the clubhouse. Yeah, I needed a bad Rafi Devers in the clubhouse in that series against New York. But the Red Sox made the playoffs, and that's step one. And the whole idea of when they traded him away and had the Giants eat his contract was that now they'd be able to spend some money. So spend it on Pete Alonso. They're probably not going to spend it on Alex Bregman, who I predict is going to go to the Seattle Mariners. Bregman could play a couple of different positions in their infield, and that's what they need. He could play second. He's spectacular at third. And if you put him in the lineup, they kept Naylor around, having that additional big thumper in the lineup to give their infield their depth. That's what I think is going to happen there. Number 6, the number 6 free agent I have is Dylan Cease, who I think is going to go to the Red Sox. The Red Sox need a big thumper, and they need some pitching depth. And I think bringing in Alonso and Cease, say, all right, we don't have Rafi Devers anymore. Let's go and get a couple of players, a couple of big free agents to fill in some holes. I think that is going to be what happens, especially if they lose Bregman. Now they have Murakami, the big third baseman. Munetaka Murakami is coming over from Japan. Notice a little Freudian slip there. He's going to go to the Dodgers. The Dodgers are going to resemble the World Baseball Classic team for Japan. Why not? The Dodgers need a third baseman. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the Dodgers have some money and some popularity in Japan. Join Yamamoto, join Ohtani, join Sasaki, Murakami. I'm sorry if that means the end of Max Muncy, but Max Muncy can move over to second base. That's the beauty of Max Muncy. He can play all over the place and pick up World Series rings. I think Murakami is coming to the Dodgers. Framber Valdez, who just a few years ago was a legit Cy Young contender. I think Baltimore is going to, the new ownership and the fact that they had such a disappointing year, they're going to look at this as saying, hey, we're kind of like the Blue Jays were. Blue Jays fell to last place in 2024, and they got to within a Will Smith toe of winning the World Series. There's still a ton of talent on that Orioles team, a ton of talent. And they had a 1 year of regression. Well, so did the Blue Jays. And then look what they did. I think adding a Framber Valdez to their pitching staff can only help. Tatsuya Imai, first of all, I hope I pronounced that name correctly, is arguably the best starting pitcher coming over from Japan. And I think the Yankees are going to sign him. The Yankees do need pitching depth. Now, they have now, to be fair, if Cole comes back and they have Fried and they have Schlittler, they do have good pitch, and they have Rodon. They have good pitching, but it doesn't take a great imagination seeing one of those pitchers having a regression. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say you can't have enough starting pitching. If I were the Yankees, I would say I don't care if we have too much, because we're going to eventually need some more pitching. You don't know exactly when Cole is coming back, and you don't know if he's going to be Garrett Cole. I would sign him. And I also have the Yankees retaining Cody Bellinger. To me, I just think there's just too much of a reason for them to do that. Now, I have two here, which are I didn't mean to make these happen like this, but when I fill them out, yeah, this is how it turned out. I have Ranger Suarez and Roberto Suarez both going to the Mets. They're going to try to swipe Suarez away from the Phillies. They're going to need their bullpen depth. So two R Suarez's are going to come to the New York Mets. And part of the reason I think that's going to happen is they're going to need that bullpen depth because I think Edwin Diaz is off to the LA Dodgers. The Dodgers need bullpen depth, and they can't afford to have Yamamoto pitching all these games. I have Michael King returning to the New York Yankees. He was part of the Juan Soto deal. He pitched well with the Yankees. He fit in well with them. He's a free agent. I think it would be silly for them not to acquire him. The Yankees are going to need some additional pitchers. And so, yeah, I have them bringing in Amai and King. King could also pitch out of the bullpen. And they're going to have an additional spot in the bullpen because I have Devin Williams of the Yankees signing with the San Francisco Giants. I can absolutely see him having a rebound year pitching in the pitcher's ballpark like in San Francisco. I have Zach Gallen heading to the LA Angels. They should be the California Angels. And I have Brandon Woodruff leaving the Brewers for the Cubs. I have former Yankee Trent Grisham going to the Houston Astros, giving them a little bit of outfield depth, and Chris Bassett heading to the Braves. Eugenio Suarez, I see heading back to the Cincinnati Reds. Shota Imanaga, I see being picked up by the KC Royals. Jorge Polanco, I see going to the Pittsburgh Pirates. Why? Well, they're going to have to find some major leaguers to put on that team with Paul Skeens. Brad Keller, I have signing with the San Diego Padres. And Lucas Giolito, I see leaving Boston and joining the Baltimore Orioles. So those are your top 25 free agents. I'm sure there's other players in there, but those are the ones that I have some prediction for. I absolutely believe in those top ones. I think Bichette and Schwarber are going absolutely nowhere. And I think Cody Bellinger is going nowhere. And I do think there's a very good chance that Kyle Tucker will sign with the Yankees, especially if Cody Bellinger signs elsewhere. But I think the Giants want to make a splash, and it makes all the sense in the world. Well, all the talk of this free agency brings us to what an anniversary that today is, and something that I really hope we understand the significance of it, because it's, well, why we didn't have free agency for nearly a century. Now, it was on this day in 1887, which was a good decade and a half before the formation of the American League, the National League put in a clause in all their players' contracts, which became colloquially known as the reserve clause. And the reserve clause is what tied players to their teams for in perpetuity or until the team saw fit to get rid of them. I don't think people realize the significance of this. I've talked about this virtually every year, and I've talked about when it ended, when the free agency was won by players. When you talk about players in the era leading up to the mid-1970s and saying they had loyalty to their team, they played with one team their whole career for the most part, and they were loyal to their teams. That's a bunch of hogwash. There was absolutely no loyalty to their teams. None, zero, zilch, because there was the reserve clause. Players could not sign with other teams unless their contract was terminated by their original team. And if you had a player who was even a superstar, they could not go out and sign with another club. Now, if a team was starting to lose money and it looked like it behooved a team to trade away one of their players to pick up some extra money and yada, 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 that happened often. The A's did that all the time. Thank goodness the A's have gotten past that. Several other lower revenue teams wound up doing that a lot. But if you were a Joe DiMaggio, or if you were a Lou Gehrig, or if you were a Hank Greenberg or whatever, you were not signing with another team, even if you wanted to, even if you knew you could make more money elsewhere, because of the reserve clause. that was adopted on this day in 1887. Here's what the clause basically said. At the end of the year, or whenever your contract is up, and you cannot come up with when you're negotiating for a new contract, if you come to an impasse, then the team has the right to renew your previous contract. And they could do this in perpetuity, or that was how it was interpreted. The end of your contract that you signed, no, you can't come up with a new contract. Well, we'll just renew the last one. Boom. That was the reserve clause. And that's what kept players attached to their original teams. And now there was one recourse. The one recourse they could have is they could sit out. They could just not show up. I'm not showing up. Nope, not going to happen. I am not showing up for spring training. I'm not showing up for the team until you get me a bigger contract. And you can say that shows disloyalty, but some of the players who did that included Joe DiMaggio, included Babe Ruth, included Sandy Koufax. Lots of players held out. We're not going to show up till you give me a contract that I want. And I'll sit out as long as I can until I get the contract I want. And this was a common practice. It was the lone bargaining chip that players had. I just won't show up. Where's your loyalty? Players were getting absolutely hammered. And a lot of times they didn't know what other players were making. You couldn't compare your salary to other people. But also, what recourse did you have? When Joe DiMaggio sat out at the beginning of the seasons, and some of the fans were booing him or whatnot, but what's he going to do? He wanted a better contract. And the Yankees were stiffing him. So, for the longest time, that's how contracts worked. And there were several lawyers for organized baseball, that's what Major League Baseball was called at the time, who took a good long look at the reserve clause and said, wait a second, what do we think this says? Oh, we're just telling everyone that means that we can renew their contract in perpetuity. That's not what it says, right? Well, you better hope that no player ever gets a look at the reserve clause with a lawyer. And there were some challenges to the reserve clause over the years, but none that had much teeth. And they would probably throw a little bit of money at a player to shut him up if they were threatening to challenge the reserve clause. And of course, baseball had an antitrust exemption, so they could do anything they wanted. What the clause actually said was at the end of that, if you were at an impasse, they could renew the contract that one time. Not in perpetuity, once. Do you see the difference? The correct interpretation what the clause says, they could do that once. What they were telling the players was, we can do this until the heat death of the universe. You see, there's a difference between those two periods of time. And there were some challenges, and finally Curt Flood truly challenged and wound up sitting out and said, when he was traded, he said, I don't accept this trade, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court and wound up losing his case. But showed some of the holes in the logic of the reserve clause. And it was Marvin Miller who came up with the idea of how to challenge it. That he took two players, Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally, and had them play an entire season without a signed contract. They renewed the previous contract, but they didn't sign anything. And at the end of the year, they said, okay, we're going to renew your previous, the contract from this last season. And they said, what contract from this last season? I never signed one. You just renewed the past one. And they took it to court, who said, yeah, actually, if the reserves clause says you can renew the previous contract, but there's no new contract to renew, it only says you can do it once. So therefore, these players are free agents. And baseball said, well, what does that mean? It means they can sign with whomever they want. Of course, the thing that really caught the players' attention to see if they could pull this off was the previous year after the 1974 World Series. Messersmith McNally was in 75. After the 74 World Series, Catfish Hunter, the best pitcher in the American League, filed that there was a breach of contract, that Charlie Finley was supposed to pay something in his life insurance policy, and he failed to do that. Therefore, it was a breach of contract, making his contract null and void. He took it to the courts. The court said, yeah, this is null and void. And baseball said, okay, so does that mean the A's can renew him? He said, no, it means he can sign with whomever he wants. And what he did is he became a millionaire, which was unheard of, making $1 million. He didn't make $1 million a year. He made $1 million, $2.5 million or something over 5 years, which was so much more than anyone had ever made. And suddenly players thought, wait a minute, we could become millionaires? And that's when the Messersmith McNally experiment happened. Free agency was born. And now we get to talk about where Kyle Tucker or Dylan Cease are going to sign. And it makes the offseason more fun. And you know what? It also, the free agency era, which was supposed to open up an era where the same teams won every year, did the exact opposite. Between 1978 and 1987, there was a different World Series champion every year. There was no team between 78 and 87 that won more than one title. It wasn't until the Dodgers won with the Kirk Gibson home run in 88. And then the year after that, you'd had the A's. The year after that, you had the Reds. The year after that, you had, the Twins won a couple there. And then you had the Blue Jays. You saw a absolute explosion of new teams winning, and teams that were moribund and completely irrelevant becoming great again during the free agency era. The exact opposite prediction of what happened. They thought if it's a free agency, all the big market teams will buy all the players and it'll be the same teams winning every year. And that's not what happened, despite people trying to say that is what happened. But a funny thing about reality, you can look it up. So on this date, way back in 1887, the reserve clause was put in. And you know what? They banked that ball players were too dumb, too lazy, or too scared to look up what it really said. And what it really said was, we get to do this once. And now Kyle Tucker, Bo Bichette, Kyle Schwarber, Pete Alonso, Alex Bregman, and all of them can cash in. Thanks so much for making Locked On MLB your first listen, and thanks for making us the #1 sports podcasting network. Let's do the trivia question. When Cardinal star Curt Flood challenged the reserve clause, it was after he was traded to the Phillies for what future Hall of Famer? What future Hall of Famer was going back to St. Louis in the infamous trade involving Curt Flood? Put your answers right down here. Talking about the free agents to be, wondering if I sound like John Candy, and analyzing why free agency is still a relatively new invention. This has been Locked On MLB. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.